23 horses perished in a single December night, and the man who buried them ran a small Kentucky stable most racing writers could not have picked out of a lineup, a barn operating outside the orbit of the bluegrass elite, where Calumet and Claiborne stamped the industry's myths. Smoke still hung in the rafters of Mercury Equine Center when the count came in, and the trainer who walked those aisles afterward owned no major stakes winners, no celebrity clients, and no place in the pages of the blood horse beyond the obituary about to be written. 6 years later, the longest shot winner since 1913 crossed the wire at Churchill Downs wearing his silks, a chestnut colt nobody had wanted, ridden by a jockey nobody had heard of, trained out of a farm most of the sport had given up on. How does a man who lost everything end up holding the most coveted trophy in American racing, with a horse claimed for the price of a used pickup truck? And what did Eric Reed do in the minutes before the Kentucky Derby, out of view of the cameras, that he refused to explain for nearly a year afterward? The answer runs backwards through bloodlines and bonfires, through claimers and broken dreams, all the way back to a family farm built one fence post at a time. Herbert Reed, Eric's father, did not inherit a thoroughbred dynasty. The man poured concrete and stacked timber and raised Mercury Equine Center with his own hands, somewhere between Versailles and Paris, Kentucky, a working barn rather than a showpiece, with paddocks fenced by men who had also done the painting. Eric grew up mucking stalls before school, holding shanks for the farrier, walking hots after morning gallops, and learning the trade from the bottom up rather than the top down. Years passed, decades passed, and the Reed barn shipped to small Kentucky tracks and Ohio ovals, ran honest claimers and the occasional allowance horse, and watched the big-name dynasties bank Derby trophies one after another while the trade press treated places like Mercury as background scenery. The pedigree gap between Calumet's classic winners and a $5,000 claimer running at Turfway Park became the gap the sport used to sort its winners from its workers, and Reed sat firmly on the worker side of that line. So did the sire who would change everything, a horse named Keen Ice, who stunned American Pharoah in the 2015 Travers Stakes at Saratoga, denying that year's Triple Crown winner an undefeated 3-year-old campaign in the final stride. Keen Ice earned recognition in that moment as the rare horse who could break a great one, and that's when the sport quietly dismissed him as a one-race anomaly. His stud career, conducted at a modest fee compared with stallions who hadn't beaten American Pharoah, got treated as the back end of a one-hit wonder. Mares of consequence didn't flock to him, and sons and daughters of consequence failed to emerge from the early crops. By the time a chestnut colt out of an unremarkable smart strike mare named Gold Strike was foaled in Kentucky in 2019, the pedigree page that should have read like a promise read like a warning instead, announcing cheap sire, cheap dam, and cheap future on every line. The verdict landed before the foal ever stood up. December 18, 2016 brought the fire that came earlier than the colt did, and it came at the worst possible hour. In the early morning dark, the Reed barn at Mercury Equine Center caught flame, and the timber, the bedding, the hay, the rafters, the wood-built character of the place that had given it warmth, all turned against the animals inside. 23 horses perished. Eric Reed, in interviews afterward, described going in and coming back out, going in and coming back out, his hands and lungs proof of what the official statements couldn't quite say. Sympathy mixed with quiet condescension is what the industry offered in response. Conventional wisdom held that a fire of that scale ended careers, that trainers absorbed insurance hits, broke leases, walked away from the trade with a story to tell their grandchildren, and nothing else to show for the decade behind them. Reed didn't walk away. He rebuilt, and the barn kept running with the horses he had left, ran the same claimers at the same tracks, attended the same morning sets in the same way, pressing ahead in a register the racing media didn't bother to record. September 2021 arrived almost 5 years to the day later, and the colt out of Goldstrike turned up in his shed row, not as a purchase, not as a homebred, not as a Keeneland yearling marked for the Spring Classics, but as a claim. $30,000 is what Rick Dawson's Red TR Racing dropped at Churchill Downs, picking up the chestnut out of a maiden claimer where bottom-tier stock changes hands and futures usually stay small, sending him to Mercury Equine Center to find out whether the bloodline had anything left to say. The price said no, and so did the maiden claimer venue. The narrow build of the colt, the late development reported by handlers who'd touched him in training, the absence of any catalog buzz at any auction the prior year, all of it agreed with the price. Every signal the sport could send announced that this man and this horse didn't belong. Spring arrived at the Reed barn the way it always had, without television cameras and without trade press visits, and the chestnut colt began working under a quiet program. Bob Baffert sat tangled in Medina Spirit appeals and California suspensions. Todd Pletcher worked Fox Hill clients, and a stable of Derby contenders polished for the calendar. Steve Asmussen ran numbers and infrastructure that Mercury Equine Center couldn't match in a generation. Patient mileage and quiet handling, that's what the Reed method ran on. In contrast to the Southern California breeze shows and the Belmont long gallops favored by the dynasties, the work tab favored light works over bullets, and the morning sets favored long gallops over 5-furlong burners. Readiness, in the Reed grammar, wasn't something to advertise, and the barn didn't advertise it. The rider hired for the colt arrived from a parallel world. Sonny Leon, a Venezuelan jockey working the Ohio and Kentucky circuit, had never been booked for a Triple Crown race. Mahoning Valley, Belterra Park, and the second-tier ovals where journeymen earn their living one mount at a time are the places where he'd built his book. Trade reporters who later examined that book described a rider with deep racecraft and modest opportunity, the sort of jockey the major agents didn't chase. The horse, registered by then as Rich Strike, presented himself as a compact, late-developing grinder rather than a flashy miler, the sort of stock the sport called workmanlike when it was being polite. Outsiders saw an ordinary colt with an ordinary rider in an ordinary stable, but Reed and Leon saw a closer waiting for a wide-open race. The proving came in fragments. Churchill Downs in September 2021 is where Rich Strike broke his maiden, the same meet at which Dawson had claimed him, and the win confirmed nothing more than basic competence at the lowest tier. From there, the colt began the long, slow climb up the Derby qualifying ladder, the system by which 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds accumulate points across designated prep races, with the top finishers earning the right to load into a Kentucky Derby gate. Tracks the dynasties rarely visited became the road for Rich Strike. At Turfway Park, the John Battaglia Memorial saw the colt close late and finish off the board, earning a modest point total. The Jeff Ruby Stakes back at Turfway delivered a third-place finish on the synthetic surface against a field of equally unfashionable contenders, adding another small handful of points to the column. At Keeneland in the Lexington Stakes, the same pattern emerged: a clean break from the gate, mid-pack pace, a late move under Leon, and a finish that landed honorably for the casual observer and pointedly for nobody outside the Reed shed row. By the closing days of April, his points total left Rich Strike outside the official Derby field of 20, marked as a first alternate, dependent entirely on a scratch that nobody on the inside expected to come. 30 seconds of bad luck stood between him and never running. The morning of May 6th, 2022 broke at Churchill Downs with the usual choreography of Derby Week, and that's when the phone calls began. D. Wayne Lucas's ethereal road, connected to ownership that had qualified him into the field, was being scratched, and the exact veterinary and strategic reasons mattered less than the consequence. The 20th Derby spot opened. Rick Dawson's phone rang, and so did Eric Reed's. Sonny Leon, whose schedule that weekend hadn't been built around a Kentucky Derby ride, took the call that would define his racing career. Rich Strike was in. 80-1 is what the morning line consensus from the industry's handicappers posted, responding the way industry consensus had responded to the colt all year. That number stood as the second longest morning line price in the history of the Kentucky Derby, exceeded only by Donerail at 91-1 in 1913, the longest priced winner the race had ever produced. The field included Epicenter, the Steve Asmussen-trained Louisiana Derby winner who arrived as the favorite, alongside Zandon, who had taken the Bluegrass Stakes for Chad Brown, and Messier and Mo Donegal and Smile Happy, the kind of catalog that produces Triple Crown campaigns rather than feel-good headlines. May 7, 2022, dawned overcast over Louisville, and 20 horses loaded into the Churchill Downs gate as the starter triggered the bell. Drawn into post 20 along the outside, Rich Strike broke cleanly under Leon and settled near the rear of the field, 18th of 20 through the opening yards. The opening pace ran hot, contested by Summer Is Tomorrow and Crown Pride, fractions reported by official charts in the range that signaled a backstretch built for closers. Through the first half-mile, the field strung out, the early leaders churning through fast splits, the favorites tracking in mid-pack, and the long shot from Mercury Equine Center pinned along the inside under a Venezuelan rider working an angle most of the broadcast booth could not see yet. Down the backstretch is where the move came. Leon dropped Rich Strike to the rail, threading a gap most jockeys in that field would have refused, then threading a second gap on the far turn that closed and opened in the space of 2 strides. Against the kickback, the colt accelerated, surging past horses that had cost 10 times what he had cost, pumping through traffic that the favored runners had been steered wide to avoid. Into the stretch, Epicenter struck the front under Joel Rosario and looked, for a long moment, like the winner Asmussen and Churchill had expected. Zandon ranged up alongside under Flavian Pratt, and the duel between the two favorites locked stride for stride down the lane. What nobody expected was what came next. On the inside, Leon and Rich Strike emerged, a chestnut blur grinding through a seam that nobody had charted, drawing alongside, drawing past, exploding through the final 16th with the kind of finishing kick the morning line had said he did not have. 2 minutes, 2.61 seconds is what the wire took, with Rich Strike 3/4 of a length in front of Epicenter and Zandon another half length back in third. NBC's call audibly broke. The tote board read 80-1. The longest odds since 1913 had just been answered. The morning after the Derby unfolded with the same choreography that had followed every Derby winner of the modern era. Trophy presentations and press conferences filled the calendar, and the traditional preparation for the Preakness. Stakes 2 weeks later at Pimlico moved forward as a matter of course, the second jewel of the Triple Crown, the race that turns a Derby winner into a Triple Crown contender. Reed and Dawson did not enter Rich Strike in the Preakness, citing recovery, the toll of the 8 1/4 furlongs run through 20 rivals, and a training history that had never run the colt back on 2 weeks of rest. The reaction from the trade press and the wagering public turned less sympathetic than the morning had been. Critics labeled the decision cowardice and ducking. Mainstream columnists argued that a Derby winner owed the public a Triple Crown attempt. Social media, where the dismissals of horse racing now travel faster than they did in 1913, treated the absence as proof that the Derby had been a fluke. Reed pressed ahead, undeterred. 3 weeks after the Preakness, the Belmont Stakes became the next target, where the long mile and a half distance suited the closing style, and Rich Strike finished 6th behind Mo Donegal in a field that did not include Epicenter. Later starts came up short. At Saratoga, the Travers, the same race in which Keen Ice had once stunned American Pharaoh, produced an honest effort without a victory. The Lucas Classic at Churchill Downs, the Clark Stakes, and the Pegasus World Cup the following winter all delivered honorable efforts and no victories at the highest level. The sport that had ignored him now demanded he prove it twice. What Reed did in the minutes before the Kentucky Derby, the detail he refused to explain for nearly a year, emerged in interviews after the season closed. Before driving from Mercury Equine Center to Churchill Downs on race day, Reed visited the spot on the farm where the 23 horses lost in the 2016 fire had been buried. Reports from those who knew him describe a quiet moment. No audience, no cameras, a small ritual of acknowledgement from a trainer who had carried that night inside him for 5.5 years before the chance to redeem it came. The opening tease, the ritual nobody had been allowed to photograph, resolved into the simplest possible image. A man stood on his own ground before driving to the largest race of his life. The bloodline that had been written off resolved a different way. Keen Ice, the stallion the catalogs had treated as a one-hit wonder after his Travers upset of American Pharoah, suddenly held the credentials of a Kentucky Derby sire, and his stud value climbed while his book filled almost overnight. The pedigree page that had read like a warning when Rich Strike was foaled in 2019 read like a promise by the end of 2022. Beyond the Reed barn entirely is where the broader legacy ran. A generation of small stable trainers, the workers rather than the dynasties, the men and women shipping claimers to Turfway and Mahoning Valley and Belterra, found in Reed's name a piece of evidence that the gate at Churchill Downs was not permanently closed to them. The claimer to classic template, the path from a $30,000 tag at a maiden race to a blanket of roses, returned to the conversation after decades of dormancy. Greatness, the Reed story argued in the quietest possible way, is often built in the places the cameras do not point. December 18, 2016 had set a fire that should have ended a career, and May 7, 2022 answered it. The cheap horse, the small barn, the burned ground, and the wide-open rail all collapsed in a final stride into a single answer the sport had spent 6 years refusing to consider. 23 horses lost in a Kentucky night. 1 horse claimed for the price of a used pickup truck. 1 rider nobody had heard of. 1 trainer most racing riders could not have picked out of a lineup. And the longest morning line price the Kentucky Derby had produced since 1913, all of it folded together in 2 minutes and 2.61 seconds along the inside rail at Churchill Downs. The people the sport overlooks are often the only ones with nothing left to protect. Was Rich Strike the unlikeliest Kentucky Derby winner in the modern era, or the most inevitable one? Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below.